Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about the Cossacks. Who were they? Where did they come from? Were they Ukrainians or Poles or Russians? Or were they just an army for hire? Or perhaps an army serving whoever ruled their land? Why are they so important to Ukrainians today? Let's start with the meaning of the word Cossack. In Ukrainian, it is pronounced Kozak. The word Cossack means free man, and it is also a synonym of the word knight, the one with the K in front, which means that Cossacks were really just Ukrainian knights. Just like in Europe, knights were really popular at the time, except Ukrainian knights for the most part governed themselves and even practiced democracy. The Cossacks are also known as the Zaporizhian Cossacks. Zaporizhia comes from the Ukrainian words meaning beyond the rapids, which refers to the river Dnipro, near and on which Zaporizhian Cossacks were settled. Knighthood was popular in the Middle Ages, and therefore it makes sense that some historians trace back the origins of the Cossacks to the 9th century. But the first time the Cossacks were mentioned in writing was at the end of the 15th century. There are myths, mainly spread by the Russians, that the Cossacks were villagers and people running away from prosecution. Does it make sense for a knight to have such a history? Not at all. Since, contrary to Russian propaganda, Cossacks were not runaway villagers that didn't know how to fight and were poor. In fact, they were nobles that were perhaps the younger sons which didn't get enough inheritance, or simply wanted more money or honor, or both. So they decided to start gathering together to protect the southern border of their country, but also to get some riches in the process. To better understand part of which state the Cossacks were, what were the surrounding states, and why there were wars between them, let's talk about the geography. At the end of the 15th century, which is when the Cossacks were first mentioned, Ukraine's lands were divided between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which got the largest part, including Kiev, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which got the smallest part, and a bit more went to the Kingdom of Poland. They were all ruled by the same Polish-Lithuanian Casimir IV, Jagiellon, or as the Polish say, Jagiellonczyk. The Grand Duchy of Moscow and the Crimean Khanate were created after the fall of the Golden Horde on those territories, and because both the Crimean Khanate and the Grand Duchy of Moscow saw an enemy in the large Grand Duchy of Lithuania, they started wars on its borders. These were the southern borders of Lithuania and were the lands of modern-day Ukraine, the lands where the Cossacks lived. The geographical position of Ukraine also made Ukrainians the main targets of the Ottoman Empire's slave trade. Ukrainians were constantly raided by the Crimean Tatars and then sold to the Ottoman Empire as slaves. The reason for that was that Muslims could not enslave Muslims. The estimate numbers of Ukrainians brought into the slave markets to the Crimean Peninsula in the 16th and 17th centuries vary from 1.5 to 3 million. Quite a hefty amount considering how much smaller the global population was. The women that the Ottomans would enslave would be made into maids, servants, and sometimes put in harems. The most famous woman that was captured was Roxolana, the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. She, in time, became the most powerful and influential woman in the Ottoman history, but more about her in a different episode. Let's get back on track. Women were captured, but so were the men. They were made into slaves or were kept as prisoners. How is any of this related to the Cossacks? The Cossacks were the knights and the saviors of those captured and enslaved. They would whether attack the routes which the Crimean Tatars took to and from the raid, or the Cossacks would in turn raid Crimea or some towns and cities in the Ottoman Empire and free the Ukrainian slaves. Therefore, the Cossacks were seen as noble, which they did come from noble blood, and as heroes. Knowing all this, some natural questions might arise. If the Cossacks were knights, were they an army? If so, whose army were they? But I have mentioned that they were self-governing. Then how is it possible for an army to govern itself? To answer these questions, let's look at how the Cossacks lived. Although it is popular to think that the Cossacks were some sort of army belonging to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they were not. Turkish traveler and explorer Abliya Çelebi, who lived in the 1600s, says that the Cossacks were considered separate from the Lithuanians, the Poles, and the Muscovites. He also mentions there being not only men as Cossacks, but women and children. In Ukrainian, the men would be Kozaki, the women Kozachki, and the children Kozachata. This further and further proves that Cossacks were not an army or servants to the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth or the Muscovites, but they were a separate nation. Sort of like the Vikings were a separate nation that developed around warfare, which remained as one of its key features. They earned money by being hired for different battles, they protected their lands, etc. So warfare never left the Cossacks. Thinking that Russians were the origin of the Cossacks is completely false. Polish and British writer and traveler Henry Krasinski wrote, quote, "We cannot assign to the Cossacks a Russian origin without rejecting the authority of a series of historical documents, the veracity and genuine character of which are indisputable." End of quote. The Cossacks originated in an area a little south of Kiev, modern day capital of Ukraine, and the first organizer of the Cossacks was actually the most important man in Kiev at the time, but more on him a little later. This proves that the Cossacks originated in Ukraine and are a Ukrainian nation. If the Cossacks were a nation, how did they live? Let's talk about that. The Cossacks were mainly earning their living from farming and trade on rivers. They also plundered and looted other countries during their wars and attacks on them. They had a navy and an artillery. In fact, Cossacks are mainly known for their navy and seafaring skills. Koshovoi Ataman Ostap Dashkevich was able to provide his Cossacks with firearms that at the beginning of the 16th century were not very common in all armies of the world. This once again signifies that the Cossacks were not poor villagers, they were of noble origin. Some of the Cossacks even participated in the Crusades and were innovators in warfare. It is a common mistake to think that the Cossacks never married. That is not true whatsoever. Cossacks had wives and children. The Sich, a fortification or the castle built by the Cossacks, was used sort of like a military base camp where they would live for a few years, train, and learn different tactics. In the Sich, they would also get a military specialty if they did not have one before. After they would go back home, create a family, live a peaceful life when there was no war. When one came up, they would then join the army. The Cossacks were democratic when it came to laws and electing heads of state. They would choose as a group in the Cossack Rada who would be their hetman or koshovoi ataman, their leader. Their heads of state were not picked based on their titles, but based on their qualifications, reputation, and authority. They were also picked democratically in an election sort of way. The Cossacks appointed and disposed of their chiefs at pleasure. If they were disappointed or displeased with how their chief was doing, they would demote him to a regular Cossack and put someone else in his place. Occasionally, there was a meeting held about the renewal of the appointed leader and other principal officers under him. Koshovoi Ataman was very powerful and influential during the war, but did not have a lot of authority during times of peace. Starshina would have more authority during times of peace. This being a more democratic society, the Cossacks were free to leave the Sich whenever they chose, but while in the Sich, they needed to follow laws. Zaporizhian Cossacks governed themselves according to the laws of Magdeburg. This meant that each city and village had autonomy and could establish its own judicial and administrative institutions. It would also create and use their own laws. This is how freedoms played out in reality. Dmitro Baida Vishnevetsky created the first siege, or fortification, where the Cossacks would live and be protected. He did that in the middle of the 16th century. Formally, he was still under the Polish king, but in reality, Vishnevetsky was completely autonomous and would do what he pleased. For example, find new allies or join wars. This Sich was a place where the Cossacks that lived on the southern border of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth resided. Cossacks living in the Sich and closer to the southern border were semi-legal. They did not get the benefits or any sort of pay from the king. Meanwhile, there were also registered Reyestrovi Cossacks that would be in the army of the king and get paid some money. They usually lived up north and did not have the siege to live or train in. These people applied to the king's army themselves and would be registered. They would have less freedom, though, since they would have to fight in the wars that the kings told them to fight in. The Cossacks that were semi legal and had the siege were called Nizovi Cossacks and had more freedoms. A hetman would rule over the registered army and, if need be, unite with the Nizovi Cossacks, while the Nizovi Cossacks were ruled over by Koshovi ataman. Nizovi would fully govern themselves, start and end wars, and even help out other armies of different countries for a reward. They were quite famous for this and took on many battles. For example, the Cossacks took part in the 30 Years' War on the side of the Habsburgs when Emperor Ferdinand II asked for help. In 1620, in the Battle of the White Mountain, 3,000 Cossacks participated. They were able to achieve success and defeated the Hungarians in that battle. And yet, the Cossacks were the ones tasked with protecting their lands and their borders. How did that come about? Going back to Yuri Pats, whom I already mentioned. Yuri Pats was most likely the first organizer of the Cossacks, but he was not just some villager, he was actually the most important man in Kiev, voivoda of Kiev, sort of like a local ruler that has control of the army. Of course, he ruled by the laws and was a representative of King Casimir IV. In 1482, the Crimean Khan, Mengli Gurey, marched to Kiev and completely destroyed it. That's when Yuri Pats came in. He was tasked with rebuilding the city of Kiev and improving the safety of it, protecting it from the Crimean Khanate. The same things were done by his successors, thus making the Cossacks protectors of their land. Another proof that the Cossacks were a Ukrainian nation and not just an army under some king is that in 1649, Bogdan Khmelnytsky announced the independent Cossack state called Hetmanshina, from the word hetman. It is also known as the Zaporizhzhan army, Visko Zaporizhske, since the state was focused around warfare and protection of the state. This is, of course, solidifying the Cossacks as truly a nation. Finally, on a French map of the 17th century by Nicolas Sanson, who was a French cartographer, you can see written Ukraine, pays des Cossacks, Ukraine, country of the Cossacks. This is not all the Cossack history that I will discuss in this podcast. This is just a preface, finding out who they are and where they are from, why they are important to Ukrainians. The Cossacks were the defenders of Ukrainian lands, but now they are also the symbol of independence and freedom that Ukrainians cherish. They are a huge part of Ukrainian cultural identity, with contributions to literature and art in Ukraine, Poland, and even Britain. Ukrainian Mykola Gogol wrote his novella Taras Bulba about a Cossack, and Ukrainian painter Ilya Repin painted a marvelous artwork called Reply of the Zaporizhian Cossacks. Meanwhile, British Lord Byron wrote a poem called Mazepa about one of the hetmans. The Cossacks were always brought back and remembered when fighting for independence. They were Ukrainians, after all. And now I would love to invite you to listen to the Zaporizhzhan Cossack March in order to really get the feel for what the Cossacks were. Thank you so much for joining me today. And this is what we need to know about Ukraine this week.